Greetings, fellow thinkers and drinkers, and welcome to part 2 of our examination regarding the conventional wisdom of Dio's impact on Black Sabbath. Last time we left off at the conclusion of the Heaven and Hell tour, which had seen Sabbath, despite a 50% change in personnel, revitalize their career through a new album and successful supporting tour. Although I did note at the time that while this was a largely positive development, I did raise a few concerns. And noticeably, quite a dramatic change in musical style, and on stage, certain issues, shall we say, regarding Dio's interpretation of the band's classic material. I also suggested that given this, my ultimate appreciation of this change within the band may well depend on their follow-up album. Which brings us nicely to the subject of this video. Little background before we proceed. Geezer Butler was once again fully involved in the writing process. Excuse me. Vinny Appice, on the other hand, unlike Bill Ward, was not a full member of the band and had been engaged to play drums, and as a result never received a writing credit. Again, the conventional wisdom holds that this release effortlessly continues the band's artistic and commercial rebirth, and it is often regarded as one of the band's finest efforts. Released in 1981, even the mob rules. So what do we get? Well, from the outset, the mob rules feels much less like a bold progression and more like a carefully structured retread of Heaven and Hell. The sequencing, the style, sound, and in particular the song construction follow a strikingly similar blueprint, as though the band had found a winning formula on Heaven and Hell and now saw very little reason to deviate from it. Let's have a look at the tracks in slightly more detail. Turn Up the Night opens proceedings much the same way as Neon Nights did before. It's fast, it's urgent, and it's designed to grab the attention. But it does lack the menace and perhaps even the urgency of Neon Nights. Instead, it comes across as noticeably more upbeat, and I don't mean that in tempo, I mean in feel and in spirit. It is almost a jolly-sounding song, which indeed I find a very strange and inappropriate adjective to be using while describing a Black Sabbath song. And this does make it sit somewhat awkwardly, or at odds, shall we say, with the band's darker identity. There is a distinctly more commercial sheen to this track. So making it, I suppose it's an effective number on its own terms, but it's most definitely a move away from the sharper, more threatening edge of Neon Nights. Okay, they follow it up with Voodoo, which settles into a heavier, more deliberate groove. Great riff here, no matter what else. And there is most definitely an enjoyable swagger to this song. But one cannot escape the sense that the band are, again, just revisiting familiar territory rather than breaking any new ground. This song does not do much. I won't say it's AC/DC-esque in that regard. I mean, that would be hyperbole, but, once the riff and the groove has been established, very little else happens in the song. And it, musically, as to say, is somewhat minimalist, despite, as I've alluded to, having a damn good riff. It comes across as a bit of a plodder. Though I'd have to say, as far as plodders go, it's a pretty good one. Okay, the Sign of the Southern Cross up next. It shifts the mood entirely. a much slower, much more atmospheric piece. Easily the most unique and individual track on this album, and perhaps across the two Dio albums. Nice gradual build to it, and Dio really does take advantage of this, indulging in his much more expansive theatrical style. The results are just simply mightily impressive, and to be fair, this really does cover, I say, new musical ground, and is an absolute monster of a song. It's easily the best and most impressive track on this album, and it rightly held as a genuine band classic. E5150 is an instrumental piece, obviously written to replace Superstar as the concert opener, and a role it would go on to fulfill with considerable effect. Although it is worlds away from the gothic charm, if you like, of Superstar, with a much more futuristic, atmospheric, keyboard-driven piece. Different, but equally effective. Which leads us nicely to the Mob Rules itself, which arrives again as, I suppose, as a central statement, much as Heaven and Hell did before. It's direct, it's forceful, and built around a very commanding riff. Though this goes more for blunt power than layered complexity of Heaven and Hell, it's fast, it's aggressive, and it does what it does damn well. Is it a bit short? Or did they just about get it right? I don't know. That would be a minor criticism. It's a great song. And something perhaps this album had more of than Heaven and Hell. It's another up-tempo effort. Now, back in the day when you used to flip the LP over, you were then presented with Country Girl, which again is a shorter, much more accessible track. Echoing perhaps the role of Lady Evil on Heaven and Hell, although that's slightly unfair. It's not that bad. In fact, it's rather good. It's quite catchy in places, and for once, Dio offers an Osbourne-esque vocal. By that I mean that his vocal melody follows the main riff. He did have to take some chaff from the rest of the band, apparently, for the title and lyrical content, but, fair enough. That's far from his worst ever effort. I've noted here it's serviceable. That's unfair. It's better than that. As I said, it's much better than something like Lady Evil on Heaven and Hell. But that does not make it essential either. They follow that up with Slipping Away, which continues in a somewhat similar vein. Again, one has to say it's competent, it's energetic, but ultimately lacking the memorability that defined the stronger moments of Heaven and Hell, and indeed on this album. I would say this is much more Walk Away than it is Die Young, but again, that is slightly unfair. There's nothing about this that's as weak and watered down as Walk Away. But again, it's not that essential either. But the guitar and bass call and answer section contained within is at least novel. We move on to Falling Off the Edge of the World, which attempts another superb dynamic shift. Starts very quiet, very acoustic, and then builds slowly but dramatically. And then culminates in one of Iommi's greatest ever riffs. And this is by far one of the more ambitious and effective tracks on the album. Extremely well constructed. And again, unforgettable riff. And this is, along with The Sign of the Southern Cross and the title track, they are easily, by some considerable margin, the best tracks on offer. The album closes, as did Heaven and Hell, with Lonely as the Wood, which they've here renamed over and over. Okay, again, I'm being slightly facetious there, but the similarities are unmistakable. It's a slower, bluesier, more reflective effort. It clearly mirrors Lonely as the Word. It's a strong closer. It's as was Lonely as the Word. It features some fine playing and singing, as did Lonely as the Word. But I'm afraid this is just an echo of what had come before. You could almost, from the minute you'd heard the opening of Turn Up the Night, it was almost predictable that this is how the album was going to close. And the simple fact of the matter is, it's a good song, but it is not as good as Lonely as the Word. And it feels more like an echo than an evolution. Well, taken as a whole, I said, you can't say that this is a weak album. It's tight, it's confident, professionally executed. Yet stylistically, and particularly, I think, in its sequencing, it often feels like a carbon copy of Heaven and Hell. It's refining a formula rather than redefining it or developing it. And as a result, it's an album that I think is satisfactory, but not exceptional, and is certainly an album that rarely offers up anything surprising. Despite Geezer Butler's, I say all this despite Geezer Butler's supposed involvement in the writing process. Again, as I said, I very much have a cut and paste feel to it vis-a-vis Heaven and Hell, which must at least raise the question as to what Butler's actual involvement in the songwriting was. Although, again, as I have alluded to, Morbid Rules is a more consistent album than Heaven and Hell. There's nothing on here that is quite as throwaway and forgettable as Lady Evil or Walk Away, but with the exception of the Sign of the Southern Cross, there is nothing here that reaches the heights of Heaven and Hell either. It is that track, plus the title track, and Falling Off the Edge of the World. Okay? Now, if you're going to play that silly game, and I play it myself on occasion, if you take those three, add Heaven and Hell, Children of the Sea, and Die Young, Neon Nights, Lonely as the Word, you got a pretty good album, I think. I think you got a damn fine album. Whereas these, I think because of the lack of development, these ideas spread across two albums, you're starting to see the thin patches. Again, I just cannot view this as a great album, as a great Black Sabbath album. When I make any such comment, it's all within context of the band. I make no comparison to the work of any third party. However, what is great is the production. Again, Martin Birch returned, and this time he does an absolutely fantastic job. Where I said that the production of Heaven and Hell was good but lacked oomph, this does not lack oomph. This has a real bottom-end resonance to it, and it could actually be one of the best-produced Black Sabbath albums ever. Now, that may not actually be the compliment in which it sounds upon initial hearing, because a lot of their albums suffered over the years from various production deficiencies, shall we say. But there is absolutely nothing to complain about here. Play it purely for that. Play it straight after Heaven and Hell. Just compare the production on it, if for no other reason. It is one of the best albums to listen to from the sound perspective. And again, what can I say? Whatever one may think of the 1970s Sabbath albums, each represented a clear progression from its predecessor. And here, I'm saying it again, the band, for the first time in their career, appeared to be copying themselves. Formula established on Heaven and Hell is reproduced here with little to no deviation. Why? I don't know. I wasn't there. Does this reflect the changing musical environment around them? As I've said, that it seemed obvious to me that the rise of the new wave of British heavy metal did inform Heaven and Hell. Did they then subsequently decide that, no, this is the way we have to go? I don't know. Were there other factors at play? Again, unfortunately, I don't know. But it does appear from the outside looking in that having rediscovered their success and having re-established themselves, they have become creatively rather timid. Interestingly, Tony Iommi has in subsequent years said, or has expressed a degree of dissatisfaction with the mob rules, going on to suggest that stronger material was discarded in favor of material which ultimately made the final cut. What does he mean by this? Again, as far as I know, he has never clarified. Does he mean that there was more experimental, more progressive, more interesting material discarded? Or does he simply mean there was more material of a similar ilk, which he personally felt to be superior? Again, as far as I know, he has never clarified those statements. Now, commercially and critically, I think it's only fair to say, despite what perhaps the conventional wisdom would have one believe, that this album fell short of matching Heaven and Hell. Didn't sell as much. And I think there were even a couple, at the time, of critical observations, somewhat along the lines of those I have just made. One can speculate, one could speculate endlessly as to the reasons for these developments. And I've given a couple of possible explanations myself. However, there is, at least in my mind, an argument to be made that some of this responsibility for the streamlining of the music and then making it more accessible, more contemporary is not the word, maybe even contemporary, but more conventional, shall we say. Some of the responsibility does lie very much with Dio. What do I mean? Well, if we examine Dio's subsequent solo career, which was about to start, a mere 2 years after the release of Mob Rules, and if we take it from Holy Diver even through to Dream Evil, you can see that the pattern there follows remarkably closely the formula established on Heaven and Hell and subsequently replicated here on Mob Rules. Specifically, there are some things that are very, very difficult to ignore. Each album will open with a fast driving track, clearly designed to replicate or recapture the urgency of Neon Nights. Think about it. Stand up and shout, we rock. King of rock and roll. Night People, okay? They're all trying to recreate Neon Nights with varying degrees of success, okay? This is immediately followed by the grand mid-pace centerpiece in the form of the title track. Each one striving for, the weight and authority of Heaven and Hell itself. Holy Diver, Last in Line, Sacred Heart, Dream Evil, all adopt this role, built around imposing, epic riffing and constructions and Dio's favored, moralistic imagery. And there's always going to be something that harks back to, say, Children of the Sea or Falling Off the Edge of the World. Starts with an acoustic atmospheric beginning and builds up into a heavier driving riff, taking the song through to its finale. We're going to think about don't talk to strangers' faces in the window, etc., etc. Okay, and equally, there is going to be something on all these Dio solo albums that does hark back to the obvious commercial intent of your Lady Evils, your Walk Away, your Country Girls, etc. There's going to think about it. There's going to be a rainbow in the dock. There's going to be a mystery, a hungry for heaven. I could have been a dreamer. All geared towards that even broader, even more mainstream appeal, and often sitting uneasily alongside the heavier, darker material. And if you accept this argument, this feels much less like an evolution and much more like a codification. And what had once seemed fresh and revitalizing on Heaven and Hell has gradually become a fixed template, being repeated with increasing predictability. I have to say, diminishing returns. Although, in fairness, I do regard Dream Evil as being one of that part of Dio's solo career, at least one of his stronger efforts. Okay, but in doing so, these records have moved decisively towards a more polished, mainstream sound, far removed from the darker, more exploratory, and at times genuinely progressive character of Sabbath 80s work. Again, we don't know, but I think I don't think it's an unfair assumption or analogy, if you like, that had Dio remained with the band, that is what we would have got. Okay, back to the Mob Rules. The band then went out on tour, as was their wont. Now, 2 official live albums document this tour. There was the contemporaneous Live Evil, which even at the time was a huge disappointment, produced by Iommi and Butler, but they produced the life out of it. It was just so sterile. Awful recording, really. No atmosphere whatsoever. However, it was remixed a couple of years ago, and if you're going to listen to Live Evil, please just listen to the remix. A game-changing experience. It really is. And the Live at Hammersmith, which was recorded... I should say Live Evil featured, in terms of new material, the Mob Rules, Voodoo, and Sign of the Southern Cross. Live at Hammersmith, regarded at a different stage of the tour, featured the Mob Rules, Voodoo, Slipping Away, and Country Girl. Okay. Now, Live at Hammersmith was released, although sort of 20 years later, I think 2004, something like that, so over 20 years after it was recorded. But at the time, and prior to the Live Evil remix, was a far superior live representation of the band on this tour. It was a rougher, perhaps rawer recording, but for all that, it did what a live album should do. That if you're drunk enough and closed your eyes, it could almost transport you to being at the concert. In the original mix of Live Evil, you would have had to have drunk that much. You would have been clinically dead before anything approaching, a transformative process even suggested itself. Now, in terms of new material, if we exclude E5150, as it was the taped introduction, every song, with the exception of Over and Over, did make it to the stage at some point on the tour. Now, while that sounds promising, there are a few caveats, which I will now point out. It was only the title track and Voodoo that survived the entire tour, or shall we say were played, as far as I can ascertain, at each and every show. Turn Up the Night and Falling Off the Edge of the World were performed initially in the tour, though very quickly discarded. We're talking 3-4 performances, something like that, and both, never to be seen again. In the case of the former, in the case of the latter, 30 years later. But that story is still to come. Country Girl and Slipping Away got roughly 20 and 30 performances, respectively, as it were featured on the Live at Hammersmith recording. The Sign of the Southern Cross, inexplicably given its qualities, was eventually incorporated into the song Heaven and Hell and received 42 performances. Now, bear in mind, when I'm giving these numbers, this was, 104, again, to the best of my knowledge, 104-date tour, which does put these things in perspective. They were not pushing the new material, not particularly aggressively. From Heaven and Hell, they retained the title track, obviously, Neon Knights and Children of the Sea, Die Young and Lady Evil were discarded. In terms of the Osbourne material, with the exception of Sweetleaf, which they mercifully dropped, they were playing the same standards as they were on the Heaven and Hell tour. I talked about them on the last video. No point repeating that here. My opinion hasn't changed. Nothing has changed in terms of the band's performance of that material. Another thing that is interesting, now subsequent to Dio's departure, and even including the first Dio reunion many years later, material, with the exception of the title track, material from the Mob Rules album has always been overlooked, or one minor exception. Why? I don't know, but I think, for what it's worth, one is justified in asking the question. There must be some degree of dissatisfaction with this material. From whom? Well, it has to be Iommi. He's been the only constant factor in the band all the way through. But no, a lot of this, once this tour was over, was never heard again. Should they have changed their set list on the Mob Rules tour? Yes, I say they should have. Now, in a relatively recent video, I discussed the Deep Purple reunion and their setlist woes. I made the point that on their second album and tour, which would have been the House of Blue Light, they really should have taken the plunge, okay, and gone for a more varied approach to their live set. Couple of points I made there, but I think the parallel to Sabbath is undeniable here. At least Sabbath at this stage of their career. They not only should have been pushing the new material, and Purple, like Sabbath at that point, had 2 albums worth of new material. They should have gained greater and more varied exposure to their back catalogue, whereas Purple were just trotting out the same hits that had featured on Made in Japan. Sabbath were still trotting out the same old chestnuts they had been, for years now. I think that was a mistake, as I've already said, that from several points of view. Dio had not been an unqualified success on the choice of Osbourne era material presented thus far, but even by this point, in 1982, there were Osbourne-era songs that he himself had been unable to sing live. He just couldn't do it. And we could go back to Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, and I think he tried it once in 1973, and it had never been heard of again. He just couldn't replicate it live, okay? And the amount, of songs that suffered from this increased as the years went by. So there was a huge pool of material there for the band to choose from, And yes, okay, I admit, this could have gone either way. He could absolutely have nailed it, as he did NIB, or it could have been, nails down a blackboard, as it was with Black Sabbath, or Iron Man, or Sweetleaf. But that's what rehearsals are for, are they not? And surely it was incumbent at some point on Iommi or Butler to have a little word with him, say, Ronnie, can you not try this a little differently, old chap? Because I maintain we could have had in the set at this point, we could have had stuff like The Writ, Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, or even Backstreet Kids. Now, this would not only have been nice for the fans, but I think it would have been good for the band, because it would have even more differentiated them from the Osbourne incarnation of the band. They had 2 albums, of their own material, but if they were, putting songs in, not just Black Sabbath, War Pigs, Iron Man, Paranoid Children of the Grave, if they were pulling out, some real deep cuts, it would have helped differentiate them, and I think it would have been much better for their brand, their identity. And let's be fair, I'm sure Dio would have absolutely been thrilled at every possible interview mentioning the fact that, it's only because I'm here that we're able to play Sabbath Bloody Sabbath or The Writ, because my predecessor was incapable of singing them. You know, I'm sure that'd have cheered him up no end. But it didn't happen. It didn't happen. We got the shows and the recordings. We got missed opportunity, possibly. Yeah. Would it have helped the band, say, develop their own identity more? Who knows? Dio was famously not that enthusiastic about singing the Osbourne-era classics. Maybe if you'd taken some of that pressure off him and say, well, look, here, Ron, give this a go. He hasn't been able to do it in 7 years, you know. Who knows? Maybe it would strengthen the band unity. Who knows? Pure speculation. Okay, I've often found it a little bit somewhat generous use of the word, shall we say, to describe the Dio period as an era at all. I mean, in reality, it amounts to, less than 3 calendar years, 2 studio albums, and 1 live release. Hardly a sustained chapter in a 50-year career, despite the weight often placed upon it. But when it comes to the breakup, I mean, it's what can I say? Yeah, the band effectively even fractured over the mixing of Live Evil. A dispute that, certainly from the outside, appears as petty as it should have been avoidable. I mean, what function do management play? Surely to some degree is to stop the temperamental tossers, the artistic ones, fucking the whole project up. Accusations, mistrust, bruised egos quickly escalated into a full-blown split, an episode that can only be described as incredibly childish from all participants. I am taking no sides on this, and I will not give we all know the story. I will not give it any further oxygen of credibility. It is pathetic. It's supposed to be grown men. But that was that. Dio left, and he obviously, as we know, he took apathy with him. Now, with half of this story still to go, I did say this would be 4 videos, and this is the second one. Why am I about to give my verdict on Dio's association with Black Sabbath? Is this not a little premature? Well, the simple fact is that although Dio would return, it was his initial tenure, which marked the last point in which Black Sabbath might still have led the genre creatively. But by the time of his return, his first return, never mind his second one, too much had changed. The musical landscape had moved on, and Sabbath had been overtaken by other bands and by events. So how does all this measure up against the conventional wisdom? Well, for me, taken as a whole, the first Dio incarnation remains a very much mixed bag. Despite all my reservations, I said that Heaven and Hell did indeed initially revitalize the band. However, the Mob Rules saw them largely treading creative water. They were no longer blazing a trail, they were very much following the pack. I am not suggesting that Dio's arrival was some kind of Pandora's box, but he did oversee the streamlining of their sound to a perhaps unfortunate degree, and he also never really came to terms with the band's back catalogue on stage. His departure then, as we now know, threw the band into a state of flux, to the extent that by the end of the decade, by the end of the 80s, they had all but lost their relevance. Now, this was obviously not Dio's fault. As the saying famously goes, it takes 2 to tango, and he's cannot no way be held responsible for any decisions made, post his departure. But still, from that business point of view, his departure, mid to long term, did the band no favors. I know this is pure speculation, but had he remained, the trajectory may have been very different. or at least the band may have continued to enjoy success throughout the 80s. I've already indicated that Dio's subsequent solo career may have been a blueprint for this, what we may have got had he remained with the band throughout the 80s. But for my part, I prefer Black Sabbath when they are being slightly more experimental and creatively adventurous. Now, if I was looking at this in real time, watching events develop, I would not have been sorry to see Dio go. I do not, even sitting here, I am not one of those who thinks that the union or the marriage between Dio and Sabbath was made in heaven, as many people do. I described it as very much as a mixed bag. Yes, he saved their ass, or perhaps they saved his ass, or they saved their mutual posteriors around the time of heaven and hell. But it quickly, I won't say degraded, that's very harsh, but it quickly became something that was very, very different and, to my mind, inferior from musically at least, from what the original incarnation of the band were doing. Now, where Sabbath would go from here is something we all know, and I will get around to talking about. But again, I say at the time, I would not have been sorry to see him go. Musically, I'm, knowing what happened, I'm still not sorry to see him go. I would not have wished the career downturn on Sabbath that ultimately resulted from that. But again, these things happen. So no, I'm not one of those that is universally positive about this. And the story is but half told. And once we pick it up, trust me, I'm going to be presenting more material. Well, the argument that his effect on Black Sabbath was not universally positive, but you're going to have to wait till next time for that. So, please feel free to like, to subscribe, to share all those good things, and obviously to comment. What do you think? And we shall pick this up next time with the first Dio reunion around 1992. So, until then, I thank you very much for your indulgence. I wish you well, and Mashonkia.